couldn't make it for whatever reason. Just hope you're listening at home. Last week I talked a little bit about, you guys can go ahead and be seated. Last week I talked a little bit about how we got to the Voice Ministries, how the name came about. And I spoke a little bit about when Moses was there standing in front of the burning bush, how God had instructed him God had given him a specific instruction to do, and that was simply to go back to lead his people out of Egypt. Egypt is a place where I was very familiar with. Egypt was a place where it was a place of bondage. It was a place of filth. It was a place of slavery. I was bound in my mind. I was bound to drugs and alcohol. I was bound by not society, but by my own experience, by my own decisions. A lot of times we tend to blame this person or that person, or it was the way I grew up. I blame that a lot of times. I blamed it on the lifestyle that I looked at. But there was other lifestyles around me. That was the lifestyle I chose to follow. And God placed in my heart to come back to the city of Tucson. Because his people were in a his people were in a place that I was familiar with. The people in Tucson, and not only Tucson, Arizona, they're in a place of bondage. They're in a place, even tradition could become a bondage. Religion is a bondage. And God said that he had heard the cries of his people. That he's looked down and he's seen the burdens of his people. So that's what God has instructed me and my wife to do, to come back and to be that voice. That voice that maybe that nobody wants to listen to. How many times were you in school and you raised up your hand, but the teacher never called upon you because she didn't want to listen to you? Or he listened to you in the beginning, but whatever answer you gave was the wrong answer. And he knew in his mind that whatever answer that you were going to give, it was possibly going to be the wrong answer. So we began to be ignored. We began to be ignored. And see, when we're ignored people, we either tend to clam up and stay quiet, or we select to be vocal. We can go either way. You can either clam up, or you can be more vocal, more loud, to get a response from somebody. You become more loud, more outrageous, more like, can't you hear me? I'm talking to you. Listen. Or you just clam up like, well, nobody listens to me anyway. I'm going to stay quiet. See, God is instructing me to come back and be that voice, the voice that that was in bondage for so long, that maybe you don't know how to be the voice. Maybe you don't know how to cry out to the Lord. Because inside, your heart's crying. Your heart's crying for help. Inside, you're pouring out, but you can't speak for whatever reason. See, and when we can't speak it, the enemy comes and confounds it. He comes and he begins to play with our emotions. He begins to tell us who we are or who we aren't. And this title of today's message is called Identity Thief. Identity Thief. How many guys have seen the movie Identity Thief? Or how many of you been a victim of identity theft? See, in the movie, this woman steals this man's identity because of the name. But in reality, the enemy wants to steal the identity of you being a child of God. He wants to steal that identity. Because if he can steal that identity, he can tell you who you're not. I said, if he can steal that identity of being a child of God and take it and hide it from you, and then tell you things that you aren't, the more that he tells you that you are, the more you're going to believe that you're not.
Amen.
Right? I'm saying the more that he tells you that you're not a child of God, the more you're going to believe his lies. The more you're going to believe his lies. See, coming back to Tucson, when we go through his word, I personalize all of his word. So when I read out of his book, I personalize it for myself. I was reading that last week. I touched on it a little bit about Nehemiah. Nehemiah looking at the walls that were once fortified walls that had been broken down. See, as coming back to Tucson, where once Tucson was a fortified city, it was a reservation, an Indian land, that when the mountains that surround Tucson, the Indians would go on top of the mountains and they would have lookouts at each point. Now Tucson is in the valley. The valley. And in that valley they would look down on them like nobody can get to them except through us. But along the ways, Tucson was God. Tucson was vulnerable because the walls weren't fortified walls. They weren't fortified walls. So I take that and I cross it over into a spiritual things. So when we first come into the things of God, we bring all our filth that we've ever held on to. We try to cross them over into the church of God. And we crossed over into the things of God with broken down walls. And we never fortify the broken down walls. Because either we don't get taught, or we don't get, or nobody listens. Nobody listens to our heart when we're speaking. When you have a lonely housewife, nobody listens to her heart. All they hear is wah, 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 because that's all she's developed. She's developed that tone that sounds like it's just, you're just nagging. You just nag like, because if you would just sit down long enough, you would notice that it's not a nag, that it's a request. It was just a simple request. See, sometimes we don't know how to make that request known to God. But in our hearts, we think we make sense of it. In our hearts. So we're here to simply say, no, all that resentment that you ever had from the past, all the men and the women that have ever lied to you in the past, I'm here to tell you that there is a God that will never lie to you. A God that if you would simply surrender your heart to Him, trust in Him, that He would never lie to you, as man or woman would. See, we're here to simply build up the walls back up. The walls that the enemy has torn down. The walls that when you once stepped foot into a church, they looked at you in judgment. Or when you stepped foot in the church, they looked at you and they tried to build you up the way they are. See, we can't do that as a church. When you come into the church, we're here and we should be able to look